They said, "We're too busy for your drama, Mom. Handle it yourself?" So I did. I revised my will without telling anyone. When they showed up demanding keys to the lake house, they found a ghost waiting instead. My name is Phoebe, and at 72, I finally stopped auditioning for a role in my children's lives. The kitchen clock ticked like a countdown, while Jennifer checked her gold watch. She did not see the folder hidden under the mail. My heart was a stone. The tea in my cup went cold as Jennifer paced the linoleum. She spoke about her debt in the market, as if I were an ATM with a pulse. Michael leaned against the doorframe, blocking my exit with his folded arms. They wanted the deed signed over before winter set in. It was for my own protection, they claimed. I watched a single bead of condensation roll down the teapot. Their voices became a dull roar of entitlement. They never asked about my sister's cancer. I remember the night Patricia died. I had called Michael 3 times while the hospital machines hissed in the dark. He had sighed into the phone, complaining about his long commute and a soccer game. Emma was the only one who sat with me in that sterile room. She held my hand while the line went flat. Now, Michael wanted to know if the lake house dock needed repair. He was already spending money he had not earned. He touched my shoulder coldly. The air in the room felt thin and sharp. I reached into my cardigan pocket and gripped the cold brass of the new keys. I had already changed the locks on the Vermont property. David, my attorney, had confirmed the charitable trusts were finalized and ironclad. My children were still arguing about paint colors for a kitchen they would never enter again. They treated my silence as submission. It was their greatest mistake. I smiled at the wall, feeling the weight of the secret. They brought the power of attorney papers on a Tuesday. Jennifer laid them out on the table like a winning hand of poker. She told me it was time to let the adults handle the heavy lifting. I looked at the signature line and felt a strange, electric thrill. They thought I was a crumbling house they could renovate or sell. Michael handed me a silver pen he had probably bought with my last birthday check. I stood up slowly, my knees popping in the quiet. I did not take the pen. Instead, I walked to the front door and opened it wide. The Connecticut wind rushed inside, smelling of dead leaves and salt. I told them to leave my house and never come back without an invitation. Jennifer laughed, a high and brittle sound that cracked when she saw my face. I was not her mother in that moment. I was a stranger holding a match. They did not know the fire had already started in the basement. Jennifer and Michael stood on my porch, stunned by the cold wind. Their expensive coats looked thin against the Connecticut chill. They didn't move until I began to close the door. Michael jammed his boot into the frame, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He wasn't the grieving son anymore. He was a creditor. "You can't just throw us out, Phoebe," he hissed. I felt the vibration of his strength against the wood. It was a warning. I stepped back, letting the door swing open. My calm seemed to rattle them more than a scream would have. Jennifer pulled a smartphone from her pocket, her fingers flying across the screen. She wasn't calling for help. She was recording. "Look at her," she whispered to the lens. "She's confused and aggressive." The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. My own daughter was building a digital cage for me. I simply folded my arms and waited. The neighbors were watching from behind their curtains. I saw the flash of a porch light across the street. Jennifer continued her performance, her voice rising to a frantic, artificial pitch. She claimed I was a danger to myself. Michael reached for the folder on the kitchen table again. He wanted those papers signed at any cost. "Just sign, Mom?" he pleaded. His eyes were desperate. He needed that lake house money to cover his failing firm. I walked to the landline and dialed a familiar number. David answered on the second ring. I didn't say hello. I just held the phone toward my children. "Tell them, David," I said. His voice came through the speaker. crisp and legal. He informed them that a restraining order was already drafted. He mentioned the video from the psychologist's office. The recording Jennifer was making would only prove my lucidity. She lowered her hand. Her phone went dark. The power dynamic shifted like a tectonic plate. Michael pulled his boot back from the threshold. He looked at Jennifer, seeking a new strategy. They hadn't expected me to have a professional shield. They thought I was alone with my grief. We only wanted what's fair, Michael muttered. He sounded small now. I looked past him at the dead garden. Fairness died with your aunt, I replied. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. I leaned against the wall, clutching my ribs. The stress was a physical weight. Jennifer saw the flicker of weakness and stepped forward. She didn't offer a hand. She reached for the folder again. You're clearly having a medical episode, she said. Her eyes were bright with a terrible hope. She wanted me to collapse. It would make everything so much easier for them. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stand perfectly straight and tall. I didn't fall. I took the folder from the table and tore the papers in half. The sound of ripping cardstock was loud in the quiet house. I tossed the scraps at their feet like confetti. Get off my property, I commanded. My voice was a low, steady blade. They looked at the ruins of their plan on the floor. Michael turned and walked toward his car without a word. Jennifer lingered, her face a mask of pure, cold hatred. The taillights of Jennifer's SUV vanished into the darkness. I locked the deadbolt and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. The silence in the hallway felt heavy. My chest still throbbed from the confrontation. I needed to see Emma. She was the only person left who didn't view me as a collection of assets. I grabbed my car keys and a thick wool scarf. The house felt like a museum of people who no longer existed. I drove toward the shore through a thick, rolling fog. The headlights struggled to pierce the gray mist. My mind kept replaying the look in Michael's eyes. It was the same look he had when he was 6 and broke a toy. He always expected me to fix the mess he made. Not this time. I reached the small cottage where Emma lived. The lights were on, casting a warm glow onto the wet gravel driveway. Emma met me at the door with a look of deep concern. She didn't ask about the money or the lake house. She just pulled me into a hug that smelled of lavender and wood smoke. You're shaking, Aunt Phoebe, she whispered. She led me to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I sat at her small table, feeling the reality of the day settle. I told her about the torn papers and the recording. We sat in silence for a long time. The wind rattled the window panes of the old cottage. Emma looked at her mother's photograph on the mantel. They won't stop, will they? She asked. I shook my head slowly. The greed had taken root years ago. I was just seeing the full harvest now. I felt a strange sense of relief in the truth. Then, my phone vibrated on the table. It was an alert from my security system. The app showed a live feed from the Vermont Lake house. Someone was standing on the back deck in the pouring rain. The figure was wearing a dark hoodie and carrying a heavy crowbar. My breath hitched in my throat as they approached the sliding glass door. They knew I was in Connecticut. They thought the house was empty and vulnerable. I zoomed in on the grainy image. It was Michael. He was breaking in. Emma leaned over my shoulder to see the screen. Her hand went to her mouth in shock. We watched as Michael smashed the glass with a single, violent swing. Shards of the past fell onto the hardwood floors. He wasn't looking for memories or family photos. He was looking for the original deed I had mentioned months ago. He didn't know the house was already empty of paper. I felt a cold, sharp resolve. I tapped the screen to call the local Vermont sheriff. I gave them the address and reported a burglary in progress. Emma watched me with wide, sad eyes. He's your son, she reminded me softly. I looked at the broken glass on the screen and sighed. He's a man who made a choice, I replied. The sirens would be there in minutes. My son was about to learn that some doors never open again. The blue and red lights flashed across the lake house monitor. I watched as the sheriff pinned Michael against the broken sliding door. Emma turned away, unable to see the shame of a family member in handcuffs. My hands were perfectly steady as I closed the app. The betrayal was complete. I felt no joy in his arrest, only a hollow sense of finality. He had handled it himself, just as he had always wanted. Jennifer called 10 minutes later, her voice a jagged edge of panic. She didn't ask how I was. She screamed about Michael's bail and the family reputation. I listened to her breath catch as I remained silent. Her corporate poise had vanished into thin air. "You've ruined us," she choked out. I looked at Emma, who was quietly washing our tea glasses. "No," I said softly. "You simply forgot who actually owned the keys." She hung up, but the pressure didn't lift from the room. I knew Jennifer's next move would be more dangerous than a crowbar. She had the passwords to my old retirement accounts from when I was ill. I sat down at Emma's laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to lock her out before she drained my life's work. The screen glowed white in the dark kitchen. My fingers hovered over the keys in fear. I logged in and saw the balance flickering. Jennifer was already there. She was moving funds into a joint account I hadn't used in years. My retirement was vanishing in real time. I tried to freeze the transfers, but the security questions had been changed. She had used my mother's maiden name and my first pet. She knew my history better than I did. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck and back. Emma saw my face and grabbed the phone. She called David immediately, while I fought the digital ghost of my daughter. We were losing thousands of dollars every minute. David's voice was a calm anchor in the storm. He told me to authorize an emergency freeze through his firm's portal. I followed his instructions, my vision blurring with exhaustion. The last transfer stopped with only pennies to spare. Jennifer had almost won the war. The silence that followed was deafening. I leaned back in the chair, my muscles trembling from the surge of adrenaline. We had saved the core of the estate, but the bridge was burned. Emma sat beside me and took my hand. "It's over now," she said. I wanted to believe her, but I knew my children better. They were cornered animals now. Cornered animals always bite. I looked at the dark window. A new notification chirped on the laptop. It wasn't from the bank or the sheriff. It was a formal email from a law firm I didn't recognize. Jennifer had filed an emergency injunction to seize the lake house. She claimed I had promised it to her. In a signed letter 3 years ago, I stared at the digital signature on the attachment. It looked exactly like my handwriting. Hick. My daughter had spent her evening learning to forge me. I stared at the forged letter on the screen, until the letters blurred into ink blots. Jennifer had mimicked my distinctive slanting script with terrifying precision. Every loop of the letter P was a mirror of my own hand. She was attempting to use my past love as a weapon against my future peace. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. This was not just greed. It was a calculated assassination of my character and my sanity. Emma sat frozen beside me. The legal injunction demanded I freeze all property changes immediately. If a judge saw that forgery, my new will could be tossed aside as a fabrication. I needed to prove my daughter was a liar before sunrise. David's voice crackled through the laptop speakers with grim urgency. He told me we needed the original journals I kept in my bedside drawer. Those pages contained the real history of my thoughts. I stood up, my joints aching from the long, freezing night. We drove back to my house in a frantic silence. The Connecticut fog had thickened into a white wall. I gripped the dashboard as Emma navigated the winding coastal roads. My mind was a whirlwind of dates and signatures. I had to find the entry from 3 years ago. That was the year I paid for Jennifer's divorce lawyer. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. I had funded the very skills she was now using to destroy me. I burst through my front door and headed for the bedroom. The house felt like a stranger's skin. I yanked open the mahogany drawer and felt for the leather-bound book. My fingers met empty space and cold dust. The journals were gone. I stood in the dark room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Someone had been inside while I was at Emma's cottage. I looked at the window and saw the latch was broken. They were ahead of me. I realized then that Jennifer hadn't been acting alone from Boston. She had hired someone to scrub my history clean. I turned to Emma, who was standing in the doorway with a pale face. "The evidence is gone," I whispered. My voice sounded thin and defeated in the hollow room. But then, Emma pointed to the floor near the nightstand. A single, torn page lay tucked under the edge of the rug. It was a receipt from a local storage unit. I grabbed the scrap of paper like it was a life raft. The date on the receipt was from last week. I hadn't rented a unit in years. Jennifer must have moved my belongings to a facility to hide them from the court. She wanted to create a void where my true intentions used to live. We had the location but no key. I looked at the clock on the wall. The storage facility opened in exactly 4 hours. Time was running out. We waited in the car outside the rusted chain link fence. The morning sun was a weak, gray smudge in the sky. I saw a familiar sedan pull into the lot. It wasn't a mover or a stranger. It was my youngest daughter, Rachel. She stepped out of the car, looking tired and guilty. She held a heavy ring of keys in her hand. Rachel looked at me and burst into tears, her loyalty to her siblings finally snapping under the weight of their cruelty. She had not come to hide the truth. She had come to return it. Rachel stood by her sedan, her shoulders slumped under a heavy coat. The keys rattled in her trembling hand like dry bones. I stepped out of my car, the gravel crunching under my boots. The cold morning air bit at my cheeks, but I felt a strange heat in my chest. Rachel looked at me with eyes red from crying. She didn't offer a hug or an excuse. She simply held out the brass ring. I took the keys, feeling the cold metal press against my palm. The silence between us felt final. We walked toward the row of orange storage doors in a grim procession. Emma stayed close to my side, her gaze fixed on the padlocks. Rachel led us to Unit 412. The metal door groaned as I yanked it upward. Inside, my life was stacked in cardboard boxes and black plastic bins. My journals lay on top of a crate like discarded trash. I reached for the leather-bound volume from 3 years ago. My fingers traced the familiar grain of the cover. Jennifer had tried to bury the truth in this dark, dusty locker. I flipped through the pages until I found the specific date. My real handwriting was fluid and messy, unlike the stiff forgery Jennifer had filed. I read the entry aloud to the empty room. It described Jennifer's divorce and the $30,000 I had given her for legal fees. I had written that she was ungrateful even then. Rachel sobbed quietly against the metal wall. She knew this evidence would destroy her sister's case. It was the absolute proof of Jennifer's long history of manipulation. I felt a cold, sharp victory. Suddenly, a black SUV roared into the gravel lot. It skidded to a halt just inches from my bumper. Jennifer jumped out, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She had tracked Rachel's phone to this exact location. Her eyes locked onto the journal in my hand. She didn't look like a finance executive anymore. She looked like a predator. Michael stood by the passenger door, his face bruised. He had apparently posted bail after his night in a cell. They were cornered, and they were ready to fight for the spoils. Jennifer stormed toward us, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete. She demanded the book, claiming it was stolen property. Michael stepped out of the car, looking ashamed but determined to follow her lead. He stayed back, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Give it to me, Mom," Jennifer hissed. Her voice was a low, dangerous vibration. I tucked the journal tightly under my arm. Emma stepped in front of me, her chin held high. The power dynamic shifted as I realized Jennifer had no legal ground here. This was a desperate, final stand. I looked Jennifer straight in the eye and laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the storage unit. "You are not a very good forger," I told her. I pointed to the entry about her divorce settlement. She went pale, her composure finally shattering into 1,000 pieces. She realized I had documented every cent I ever gave her. The paper trail was long and bloody. Michael looked at her in confusion. He hadn't known about the extra money I gave her. The siblings were finally turning on each other in the dust. Jennifer screamed at Michael, blaming him for getting caught at the lake house. She called him a fool and a failure. Michael finally looked up, his face hardening with a new kind of anger. He realized Jennifer had been lying to him as much as to me. He walked toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. I watched my children tear each other apart over a pile of boxes. It was a pathetic, ugly sight. Rachel covered her ears and sank to the floor. The family unit was officially dead and buried here. I signaled to David, who was waiting in his car by the entrance. He drove forward, his professional presence cooling the heated air. He stepped out with a digital recorder in his hand. He had heard every word of Jennifer's confession. He informed her that the forgery was now a criminal matter. The state police were already on their way to the facility. Jennifer's eyes darted around the lot like a trapped bird. She realized she had lost everything in a single morning. Her career and her freedom were hanging by a single, thin thread. The sirens began to wail in the distance. Michael sat on the bumper of the SUV and buried his face in his hands. Jennifer just stood there, staring at the journal I still held. She looked small and defeated against the rising sun. I felt a sudden, unexpected wave of pity for her. She had spent her life chasing a ghost that didn't exist. I turned my back on them and walked toward Emma's car. I had my journals and my dignity back. As we drove away, I saw the first patrol car arrive. The state police arrived as the morning sun finally broke through the gray Connecticut mist. Jennifer didn't fight as they led her away for questioning. Though the police held her for hours, she was released pending a formal hearing, fueling her final, desperate rage. Michael sat on the gravel, his head in his hands, staring at nothing. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was a secondary character in his own disaster. I didn't stop to watch them anymore. I had a final destination in mind. I needed to see the lake house one last time, before the winter ice set in. Emma drove me north. The heater hummed against the biting cold of the early December air. We reached the Vermont border by noon, passing through quiet towns filled with wood smoke and dying leaves. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm as the familiar pines appeared. The lake house stood at the end of the long, winding dirt drive. It looked smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I had finally grown larger than the memories. The broken glass of the sliding door glinted like diamonds in the pale winter light. I stepped out of the car and felt the crunch of frozen grass beneath my heavy boots. The air smelled of pine needles and cold water. I walked to the deck where Michael had used the crowbar. The jagged shards of glass were a reminder of how quickly greed could shatter 40 years of peace. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt a strange, hollowed-out kind of clarity. Emma followed me, her footsteps light on the wooden planks. We stood together, looking out at the dark, still water of the lake. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old brass key. It was the original one my husband had given me when we bought the place. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the worn ridges and the cold weight. This house was supposed to be a legacy of love. Instead, it had become a battlefield for 3 people, who didn't even like the sound of the wind in the trees. I handed the key to Emma. Her fingers brushed mine as she took it. Her eyes were wet. Emma looked at the key and then at the house. "Are you sure about this, Aunt Phoebe?" she asked. I nodded without hesitation. The legal battle was effectively over. Jennifer's forgery had seen to that. The house was hers now. A gift for the daughter who had stayed when the world went dark. The house needs a soul that understands its value, I said. I watched her grip the metal tightly. She belonged here in a way my children never would. She knew how to handle the quiet. We spent the afternoon boarding up the broken door to keep out the coming snow. Every hammer strike felt like a nail in the coffin of my old life. I found an old photo of the children on the mantel and tucked it into my coat. It was a relic of a time before the entitlement took root. The house was clean and silent once more. We packed our things as the shadows grew long across the water. The lake was beginning to freeze at the very edges. Before we left, I walked down to the small wooden dock. I remembered teaching Michael how to bait a hook right on this spot. He had been so proud of his first sunfish. Now, he was a man who saw this wood only as equity. The water lapped against the pilings with a lonely, rhythmic sound. I realized that you cannot force people to be grateful. You can only choose who gets to share your light. I turned my back on the water and walked toward the car. The drive home was quiet and peaceful. Emma played some soft music on the radio while I watched the stars appear. I felt a sudden sense of lightness in my chest. The weight of being a provider for people who only wanted to take was gone. I was 72 and finally free of the drama they had projected onto me. We reached my house in Connecticut, just as the first few snowflakes began to fall. The porch light was on, waiting for me in the cold. I checked my mail and found a letter from a local charity for single mothers. It was a thank you note for the trust I had established. Reading it felt better than any holiday card my children had sent in a decade. I sat in my armchair and listened to the house settle. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. The distinction was finally clear to me. I had handled it myself, and the results were magnificent. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of my own home. My phone buzzed on the side table. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize at first. I opened the message and felt my blood turn to ice. It was a photo of the lake house, taken just minutes ago from the tree line. Below the image was a single sentence in Rachel's handwriting. "You forgot about the basement entrance, Mom." I looked at the dark window of my living room. I wasn't the only one who knew how to stay 3 steps ahead. The locks were not enough. I dropped the phone onto the rug, the screen glowing like a dying star. Rachel was the quiet one, the teacher who hid behind excuses. I never suspected her of harboring a cold, tactical streak. My hands flew to the security panel by the front door. The red light blinked steadily, mocking my false sense of safety. I realized then that my children had divided their labor. While Jennifer forged and Michael smashed, Rachel had simply watched and waited for the perfect opening. I called David, but his line went straight to a recorded message. I was alone in the house with the snow falling outside. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight cold and reassuring. I had to get back to the lake house before they found the hidden wall safe. It contained the original deeds and my husband's jewelry. My autonomy was once again under a direct and violent threat. Emma burst through the door, her face pale and her breathing ragged. She had received the same photo on her own device. We didn't exchange words. The urgency was written in the air between us. We ran to her car, the tires spinning on the fresh, slick ice. The drive back to Vermont felt like a descent into a frozen purgatory. I watched the dark trees blur past the window. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Rachel was already inside. We reached the lake house, just as the moon peeked through the clouds. A single light flickered in the basement window, casting a long shadow. I told Emma to stay in the car and call the local police. I stepped into the snow, my boots sinking deep into the white powder. I approached the hidden entrance behind the woodpile. The door was hanging open, its hinges bent and broken. The smell of old dampness and gasoline drifted out from the dark. I descended the stairs, the iron poker gripped tightly in my right hand. Rachel was standing by the safe, a blowtorch hissing in her grip. The blue flame illuminated her face, which was devoid of any guilt. She didn't look up when I entered the small room. "You always liked her best," she muttered, referring to the niece. I saw the canisters of fuel lined up along the wall. She wasn't just here for the money. She was here for the fire. I raised the poker, but a hand grabbed my shoulder from the darkness behind me. Michael's voice whispered in my ear. Hot and smelling of cheap whiskey. He had not stayed at the station long. He had been released on a signature bond within hours, and he had driven straight back to the lake house to finish what he started. "We're handling it, Mom," he said with a terrifying, calm smile. He took the poker from my hand as if I were a child. I realized my mistake too late. They weren't fighting each other anymore. They had finally decided to work together. But as Michael reached for the gasoline, the shadows outside erupted with the heavy thud of tactical boots and the roar of a loudspeaker. Emma hadn't just called the police. She had led the state troopers through the woods to the very entrance Rachel left open. The light of the law finally washed away the darkness of their greed. I walked out into the cold night, leaving the fire they tried to start behind them forever.